I'm Robin Herne, and this is an hour's worth of overview, starting a little with a self-introductory element, and then I'm going to drift into talking to you about ancient Egyptian Kemetic morality and ethical philosophy. And if I talk fast enough, a little bit on magic and how the two subjects interrelate. So first off, a little bit about myself. I'll keep it short because that's usually quite boring self-introductions. I've written a number of books for Moon Books. The first one, trying to go in order, that I wrote was this one. That looks visible. Old Gods, New Druids, and is an introduction to modern day Druidry, or at least a particular form of modern day Druidry from a polytheist perspective, and how people can practice it, bearing in mind there are lots of different styles of Druidry and different ways of practicing, so this is just my take on it, and was based upon a set of lessons developed within the Druid group of which I'm a member. I think we're in our, is it 25th, 26th year, something like that, we've been going there. And I am, in terms of thinking about future books to write, I'm now thinking about doing a kind of a sort of a follow-up to this, thinking about the Ogham or Ogham alphabet, depending on how you wish to pronounce that, which is an ancient Irish alphabet that can be used within ritual, within meditation, as an aid to storytelling and poetry, and all sorts of other things as well. So there will be a sort of a follow-up to that one at some stage, assuming, of course, Moon Books like it and want to publish it. From there, we went on to Bard Song, which is a collection of my own poetry, written in various Welsh and Irish meters. And the book does include, which is a bit of, I think, a relatively unusual feature. I don't think there's many other books like that. It includes instructions for you, the reader, if you would like to use those same metrical styles yourself as a sort of a how-to guide. There's also a chapter with Scandinavian meters and Greek and Roman meters included. And I've contributed various chapters to anthologies. I could only actually find one offhand that's a bit disorganized and crappy, isn't it? But the one I could find offhand, searching for ones, is a chapter in this anthology of poetry, Moon Diets, which includes poetry by all sorts of other Moon Book writers, including Tiffany Cheney. Who else have we got? Romany Rivers, Beverly Price, who's a friend of mine, lives in the same town I do, Martin Paladin, and various other people who've all contributed. Lorna Smithers contributed chapters to this book of their own poetry as well as a chapter of mine. And the various other anthologies, I think I'm up to about six Moon Books anthologies I've got chapters in. And from there, we went on to A Dangerous Place, which is also an anthology, but entirely of my own work rather than shared with anybody else. This is, I quite like this one, which is very vain of me to say so, I appreciate. But it's a set of murder mysteries, and I'm a great lover of murder mystery books. Each of these murder mysteries is set in the town I live in, but in a different period of history. So it's not the same characters or the same detective or anything like that. It's the same place. And it kind of leapfrogs forward, each story leapfrogs forward a few centuries from the last one. And it's the idea of the spirit of place being present. And just as there are very happy, joyful, positive spirits of place, so there are also sometimes malevolent, dangerous spirits of place. And so this explores that idea. And each of the murder mysteries contained is related to mysticism, magic, paganism, religious concepts and ideas of various types that create a background and quite often a driving motivation behind a lot of the crimes. I'm thinking about, I'm about 2/3 of the way through writing a full-length novel featuring one of the characters that appears in one of these chapters. I guess, so again, another murder mystery set in Ipswich, but in the 18th century. And exploring notions of cunning men and wise women and all of the sort of politics and dynamism and beliefs about fairy folk and all kinds of things that existed at that point in history, of how they were understood in that bubble of time and place. And some rather gruesome crimes take place around it. So if Moon Books likes it, that might end up being published. It'll end up being written even if it doesn't get published. The one I'd like to talk to you a bit more about is this one, Pantheon, the Egyptians. which is coming out next year. This is an advanced copy. So this is part of an ongoing series of books by various different authors looking at different pantheons, Greek, Celtic, Nordic, and so on. So this is the Egyptian inclusion. As you will have gathered from the first book, Old Gods, New Druids, I am a druid by practice. So you might well be asking yourself, well, what the hell is he writing a book about Egyptian gods and mythology and ritual and practice for? It's because, like many polytheists, I am not tied to one particular tradition to the exclusion of all others. So whilst in some religions, perhaps if you're a Catholic, you can't also be a Baptist or an Anglican or a Christadelphian or whatever. Within a polytheist approach, you don't have to be confined to only one thing. So if a number of different deities from different pantheons, different cultures, different traditions call to your soul and stake their claim within you, then there is no reason why you can't be honouring Celtic deities on a Monday and Egyptian deities on a Tuesday and Chinese Taoist deities on a Wednesday, according to the nature of the relationship you have with your gods and deities. So whilst I am primarily a druid, I also have an ongoing passion for Kemeticism, which is one of the names for ancient Egyptian religion. It's not an ancient Egyptian word, Kemeticism. It's based on an ancient Egyptian word, the word Kemet, which is one of the names that the people of that land used in their own language to describe their country. Kemet means the Black Land. So we don't really know quite how they describe their own religion. Whereas these days people might say they're a Christian or a Buddhist or a Hindu or an atheist or whatever to describe their way of thinking, their way of beliefs, or in the case of atheists, kind of what they don't believe in as much as anything. The further back into ancient history we go, the less common it was to have a particular word, because you grew up in a culture and pretty much everyone in your culture believed in Egyptian deities or Greek deities or Roman deities or whatever it might be. So you didn't as such need to distinguish yourself from other followers of other deities because, well, if everyone is of a like mind in your town, your village, your city, why do you need to label yourself? So Kemeticism is a word based upon an ancient Egyptian word, but introduced into a modern context to describe the religious practices not only of Egypt umpty thousand years ago, but also of people who follow Egyptian deities today in the 21st century. And I have various Egyptian as well as Irish and Welsh deities, British deities and so on, that I like to communicate with, and who occasionally communicate to me as well. I don't get the voices and respond accordingly. So that's, I think, enough waffle about me. So the main topic that I wanted to talk to you about, which I'm sort of already partly started on in terms of talking about Egyptian issues, is Egyptian philosophy and ethics. I work for a university department teaching philosophy and ethics and religious studies and psychology and sociology and a variety of interrelated subjects. They all tend to somewhat overlap, I find, within the humanities, these subjects. And so ethics and philosophy is a particular passion of mine. And I think the Egyptian take is particularly fascinating. Now, it's worth bearing in mind that the ancient Egyptian culture, before eventually Christianity and then slightly further down the historical line, Islam became dominant in the land of Egypt. Egypt, during the period of having multiple gods and goddesses freely, openly, publicly worshipped, lasted for a remarkably long time. And the land itself is very large. It spreads out over a large area. And within that large area, you've got various tribal districts, various regions and areas in which people had their own local variations and ideas of ritual, of philosophy, of which particular gods or goddesses they were uniquely devoted to in that area, which festivals they held to, and so on. So although we're talking about Kemetic religion as if it were somehow a unified singular entity, it wasn't. It was quite diverse with shifting patterns over time. So the sort of faith practiced in Abu Simbel 4,000 years ago would have been different from the sort of faith being practiced 2,000 years ago. Maybe not different in huge, massive, gigantic ways, but having subtle differences of focus, of understanding, of practice, of how those religious ceremonies were carried out, and of course of the underpinning philosophical ideas and notions about the afterlife, notions about how one should live in this life in terms of moral standards and behaviors, and what was a desirable way to live and what was an undesirable way to live. So what I'm going to talk to you about in the remaining 50-ish minutes is a bit of a broad swathe overview, rather than necessarily something quite centered and specific to this region or that region, to this era or that era of Egyptian history. So the two chief concepts to start with initially, which were consistent in all fairness across most of Egyptian history and most of the tribal districts for which there is decent archaeological evidence, are Ma'at and Izvet. Ma'at is a complex notion, and it doesn't translate easily into one single word in modern English, or for that matter, modern French, modern Spanish, modern Swahili, modern anything else. But we'll stick with English for the moment. Ma'at combines a number of ideas all rolled into one. So we would, whereas in English we would use lots of different words to cover each of these ideas, for the Egyptian, Ma'at meant the whole lot kind of put into one context. So it's order, the harmonious order of the universe. And one way of thinking about that is rather to think of the grain of wood. So you've got a branch or a plank of wood or whatever it might be, and that wood has a natural grain. And if you're carving the wood, you've got, in essence, two main choices. You can carve with the flow of the wood and go where the wood wants to go itself, or you can be awkward and difficult and stubborn and try and carve against the grain of the wood, in which case the wood is going to splinter and shatter and knot, and you're going to probably blunt your chisel and do all sorts of other things. So it's an understanding that within the universe there is a natural flow. And this is an idea that you also find within Taoism in China, the idea of a natural flow to the universe, and that you can move in harmony with that flow. And if you're sensible, that is what you do. Or you can be bloody-minded and difficult and try and go against the flow. But trying to go against it will create all sorts of problems. And one of the problems created by going against the flow is Izvet, which is disorder. And just as Ma'at is a complex notion for which we have multiple words in English, so Izvet is also a quite complex notion with multiple words in English. So whereas one embodies notions of order and harmony and natural flow, the other, Izvet, is chaos and disorder and disharmony and disruption. It's going against the flow. It's almost like trying to push a river in the wrong direction, right? So rather than allowing it to flow where it wants to flow. Or indeed, for that matter, blocking a river, because the water will then stagnate. And Izvet, there is a sort of a sense of, it doesn't quite mean stagnation in that way, but it does have a sense that if you block the natural flow of the universe, you create a barrier against which that flow kind of runs up, then what you get on the blocked side is stagnating energy, is a stagnating presence. The mind that is blocked and is unable to flow stagnates. And whilst it would be tempting to use words like good and evil, Ma'at and Izvet, they don't quite mean good and evil in the way we think of it in the 21st century. But there is that sense that the stagnant mind is a dangerous mind, it's a malevolent mind, it's a corrupting mind. And just as you wouldn't really want to drink stagnant water, it wouldn't do you any good. You'd be heaving for days afterwards. So to imbibe ideas, thoughts, energies, if you want to be a little bit quasi-mystical, from someone who is stagnating is to drink of polluted water, if you like. It's to take into yourself something that will do you no good. And so in that sense, the person who is vet, or the place that is vet, or the animal that is vet, because it's not just something restricted to human beings. That which becomes is vet has a corrupting influence on those who get too close. It's disruptive, it's polluting, it's like drinking stagnant water in a sense, to spend too long in the presence of that place, or that person, or whatever it may be, an object perhaps. I quite like this idea, phrase sick building syndrome. I know it's used to mean problems with concrete crumbling and things like that, quite prosaic concepts. Or having air vents that transmit people coughing their lungs up, and then it carries into another part of the building and everyone else there gets infected. So it means quite pragmatic things. But I have been in buildings which were just horrible. I don't mean hideous wallpaper or bad architecture, although that's part of it, I suspect. But where there was a presence of something just nasty and unpleasant and bitter and resentful and dangerous. I've equally been in places that are absolutely lovely, but if you're I mean, let's say for argument's sake, we're talking about a shop, and like the stereotypical male shopper, you're in, you're out in 5 minutes flat, you might not be in that place long enough to sense or really be particularly affected by the unpleasant atmosphere. But if it's somewhere you live or somewhere you have to work for long periods of time, and you can't just kind of in and out in 5 minutes, you've got to be there, then you become immersed in that corruptive atmosphere, which is a little bit the idea, going back to the Dangerous Place novels, collection of short stories, kind of dealt with that idea that the place itself can become a kind of a sick building, or even a sick woodland grove, or a sick mountain top. It doesn't have to be a human structure, but a place in which there is something stagnant and blocked and malevolent, because it's not flowing in the way that Ma'at would like it to flow. Also wrapped up with this idea of Ma'at is the concept of beauty, which goes with harmony. There's been quite a lot of research done on things like facial proportions, which obviously I don't know, beyond such things, unfortunately. But remarkably beautiful or handsome actors and actresses and models and so forth can be shown to have facial harmony in terms of the mathematical proportions around their face. Equally, you can look at buildings. Buildings in harmonious mathematical proportion, and conversely, buildings which are out of proportion, where things are not right, are not as they should be. They look odd in much the same way that someone whose eyes are far too close together can look rather odd, even if perhaps in first glance you don't automatically know what's odd about them. It becomes apparent after a while that things that are out of balance, out of harmony, out of proportion are not comfortable to be around. If anyone's ever been into one of those fairground haunted house type places, where often the doors are on the skew and the windows are wonky, and everything is designed to be off kilter and out of proportion, so that after 5-10 minutes of walking through it, you start to feel a bit seasick, because nothing is quite as it should be, nothing is in proportion. And it's that idea that beauty, and what is beautiful, so this person is beautiful, that person is beautiful, and obviously there's a very subjective element to that. Someone I think is stunningly handsome, somebody else might think is very average or very plain or whatever. So yes, it is a very subjective idea, but within this Egyptian context, beauty, whether we're talking about a human face or an animal or a tree or a building, a statue, or whatever it might be, it's to do with the sense of proportion, balance, of harmony, of everything being just so, just right, just as it should be. Whereas disproportion is that everything is lumpy and out of sync and in the wrong place. and nothing is quite as it is meant to be. So it's about having a sense of structure and harmony and things going in a pleasing flow. But it's also about good social relations. I probably shouldn't use that word good, because having said it's not about good and evil, I'm now really confusing it a little by using that word again. To have a society run harmoniously is to have a society in which there is fairness, there is balance, there is right and proportionate treatment of the various different people within society. And just as within Hinduism, within Taoism, within quite a number of religions, within Romuva in Lithuania, you have the notion of dharma, or of harmonious balance, which is more to do with interrelationships between people, being at peace with different people, to be at peace with yourself, to be at peace with your immediate family, which includes the four-legged and the ringed and whatever other types of creatures you share your household with, to be in harmony with the spirits you share your household with, your ancestors, your next-door neighbours, the people on the street, the people in the village or the town, whatever it is. So it's this idea that you kind of start small. Well, this is the Lithuanian idea. You start small within yourself, to be at peace with yourself rather than consumed with self-hatred or discord in your own psyche. And then you gradually expand that outwards to greater and greater levels of harmony, in as much as you can. And obviously there will be times when you bump into someone or something who, try as you might, that it's a bit like smashing your head against a brick wall to be in peace and harmony with them, but you give it a go. Society can facilitate harmonious relations through law and order. And ma'at is also to do with law and order, the passing of correct laws, righteous laws, laws that sit harmoniously, human laws that sit harmoniously with spiritual laws, rather than in discord with spiritual laws. Or a society can be run very badly, where the law corrupts and creates disorder and disharmony and generates conflict and chaos, is either because the law, the way it's composed by politicians, is just very, very bad, or the way it's implemented by judges or well, in modern times, police officers, whoever it may be in a given society, it's not implemented the way it should be implemented. So it's about fairness and proportion and harmony within a legal context in terms of running societies and governments and so on, but also just in terms of the day-to-day context of how you and I behave towards each other, behave towards friends and family and neighbours and people we work with, and if you have customers, if you work in a shop, towards your customers, all of that sort of thing, how you engage at a harmonious level. And we can of course expand that, having already mentioned the non-human, but this is as much to do with harmonious treatment of other living beings, plants and animals, and as for animists, as I take an animist stance, the spirits of rocks and rivers and so forth, that we should be in harmony with the various forces around us. Oh, message there from Joanne. Yes, I would go along with that. There are probably, I dare say, there are bits within Buddhism that would not fit entirely within what I'm saying, but certainly this part, yes. That needs to be in peace and in balance, and to treat fairly the people around you. Now, one of the features, and I'll just find a little quote for you, of Ma'at is that in the books detailing, and that there are a couple, detailing the journeys of the recently deceased and what they can expect to experience, talk about the soul of the deceased going through a long journey in which they will need the various amulets and magical spell scrolls and all sorts of things that have been inserted under the wrappings of their mummified corpse, if indeed they have been mummified. Of course, not everyone could afford to be mummified, and if Fred West happened to bury you under the patio, I don't suppose he would have bothered mummifying you first. So not everyone got the benefits of this, and therein is a whole issue in itself. But for those who were properly mummified, had the full rites, got to the afterlife, they would arrive in the halls of Amenti. And there they would face the 42 assessors of the dead. Now, it's worth bearing in mind that there's a huge overlap between geography and spirituality in Egypt. And landscape features play a huge role in Egyptian mythology, but also political arrangements, similar to the way in Ireland. And the 5 provinces of Ireland are reflected in many different ways in Irish mythology and spirituality. So the 42 judges or assessors are reflective of the fact that there were 42 tribal districts throughout the whole of Upper and Lower Egypt. So 42 regions. I suppose you could think of them a little bit like counties, maybe, these tribal districts, little areas within Egypt, each with their own administrative bodies, their mayors, the Kharetepeya, their own kind of politicians, and priests and temples and one thing and another. So there are 42 of them. These 42 assessors take it in turns. Each one asks you, the newly dead soul, have you done so-and-so thing? And you're meant to reply with a formulaic phrase saying either, yes, I have done that thing, or no, I haven't done that thing. And the more you can say, no, I haven't, the better you will be. The lighter your heart will be, your which is being weighed in the scales of Ma'at, because Ma'at is not only a force, but is the very goddess who is the personification, the embodiment, the regulating power of that force. So she, Ma'at, is the scales are her, and your heart is in one dish of the scales, and the feather of justice is in the other. And in order to pass on to the blissful and the wonderful afterlife awaiting you, your heart, your must be lighter than the feather. And the more you say, well, actually, yeah, I did that 3 times, and that one year I did that about 12 times, the heavier and the heavier and the heavier your heart gets, until the scales go clonk and your heart is just too heavy to pass on through. And the gods pick it up, your heart, which has been removed by the embalmers and placed in a canopic jar for the purpose. They pick it up and they lob it at a monster called a Menayet, and she eats it. Now, it's not wholly clear in terms of translated text whether that means that you just blink out of existence and you're gone forevermore, or possibly some translations argue that maybe you reincarnate. So you go through the jaws of a Menayet and have a new body somewhere else and another crack at getting it right. How many cracks do you have at getting it right? And do you eventually reach upon this? Look, you've done this 304 times. You're just pissing around. Sorry, you're out of existence now. Or do you just go on and on and on for the rest of eternity, having another go and another go and another go? And I'm not going to make a single comment about educational systems in that respect. But we don't know the details of that. What we do know are the translations we have, and some of the words are very difficult to translate. So there are some of these 42 where it's really not very clear what's being said. And we could, if we had loads and loads of time, sit and waffle endlessly about what some of the more obscure ones might mean. But I don't want to do that because it would be very dry and we just don't have the time. So what I'm going to give you is the 13th one. There are several other versions of this, which don't always accord with the order of this particular version that I'm running through here. But the 13th one, so the judge stands up and says, have you done this? And you're meant to reply, hail Basti, who comes forth from Bast. I have not eaten the heart. So quite a nice short one there. So Basti is the assessor who is saying, oh, have you done this? And you're meant to say, no, I haven't. And there is a sort of a debate to be had in terms of what does it mean to eat the heart? Now, I suppose if you were a real literalist, you could think of this as some rather cannibalistic activity. But let's hope that it wasn't. I mean, whilst I think it's quite a good idea to warn people against cannibalism, because generally it's somewhat unsanitary. If you ever met anyone you'd actually want to eat, ooh. However, it probably doesn't mean actually sitting there chewing away on someone's heart. What it's much more likely to mean, at least according to many linguists and historians and so on, is jealousy, envy, eating yourself, to be like Othello in, Iago in the play Othello, so consumed with your own bitterness that the green-eyed monster doth eat the meat which it mocks, and then you just eat yourself alive. Which relates to an idea I find quite interesting and intriguing, a Latin idea rather than an Egyptian idea necessarily. In ancient Rome and well into the Christian period, in fact, there are many very traditional Catholics, the ones who love the Latin Mass that was done away with a few decades back, who would still perhaps use the Latin term today, as well as people in ancient times. And that term is invidia. And from invidia, we get the modern English word envy. So it became one of the 7 deadly sins, the sin of invidia, the sin of envy, the green-eyed monster. In the early sense, both as it was used by the pagan Romans and also then by Catholics who took on board the concept and the term, invidia is to resent other people having things that you do not believe they deserve. So it's not just jealousy, that man over there's got a really nice car, I really want that car. It's not just that kind of bog standard level of jealousy. Rather, invidia is feeling that man doesn't deserve that car. He shouldn't have that car. Maybe I should have it, but he definitely shouldn't have it. He doesn't deserve it. And it eats and it eats and it eats to the point where the individual consumed by invidia, who has eaten their heart, eaten their will destroy what the other person has to prevent them from having it. That you'll go and smash up their car to ensure they cannot have it. So even if you can't have it, so not necessarily that you nick the car for yourself, which perhaps is more the idea within fairly standard jealousy. You like 2 children fighting over a toy, and one child steals the toy from the other because they're jealous and they want the toy for themselves. It's not simply that. It's so resenting at somebody else getting that which you do not think they deserve. And it's taking on board the role of judge yourself, of assessor yourself, you deciding what they deserve. Not some divine presence like the goddess Ma'at, but you deciding what they do or do not deserve, that you then destroy it because it is not right that they have that thing which you don't think they ought to have. And it's that kind of caustic, plotting, planning, feuding. How many murders are committed where maybe the wife is running off with the milkman, or the husband is running off with the milkman for that matter, and the scorned partner, the one who's left behind, says, I so resent the milkman having you that I will kill you so that the milkman can't. It's not that maybe I don't want anyone, can't stand the sight of you anymore, but it's not that. It's the sheer hatred of the milkman having you. He should not have you, therefore no one will have you. I'll kill you. It's that kind of corrosive desire to deny other people what you feel they should not have, built out of a sense of justice, but a very misplaced sense of justice, in which the individual believes that they understand what is just, what is right. Why do people we don't like have nice lives? Do we brood more over that than over the question of why do people we do like have miserable lives? Well, I'm sure there must be some people in the world who are weighed down more by the latter issue than the former. But there's quite a lot of people who are really taken up with how very dare he have this, how very dare she have that. And it's that whole very invidia of eating the heart of the Declaration of Innocence number 13 as something you should strive not to do in life, not allow yourself to become so eaten up by resentment of what other people have, of envy and of jealousy and of invidia and of self-consumption, that you not only maybe go and destroy the thing that you don't think they should have, but you destroy yourself in the process. You rip out your own heart. You become a very cold, resentful, embittered, jealous person who's got no warmth, no love, no wisdom and insight. And for the Egyptians, whereas we commonly in Western Europe, at any rate, commonly think of the heart as symbolic of romance and love and affection. For the Egyptians, the heart was well, a little bit of that, but more the notion that this is where your soul, your conscience, your morality, your decency, your very essence, your spirit resided, was here in your chest, rather than in your brain, down here. So to eat it up is not just destroying your capacity to love, it's destroying your capacity to think clearly, to reason, to have a sense of humility, a sense of balance, a sense of fairness. And that, of course, is part of balance, is to know your own limits. So ma'at is as much about thinking, well, where there are things going on in life, horrible things happening to nice people, lovely things happening to rotten people, it's unjust, it's unfair, it's imbalanced. Well, is it because you don't have the perspective of Ma'at, the goddess, the Necheret, to understand what is balanced, what is just, what is harmonious? And so you're making a stacked decision based on a very small picture of a grand scheme, and getting your knickers in a twist over something that you probably shouldn't be getting your knickers in a twist over, because it's not that massive a deal, not that big a deal, and you're eating yourself alive in the process of all of these resentments and angers and jealousies. There's a variety of others which I might do some separate podcast at some point in the future where I can ramble inanely on for hours and hours and hours, rather than trying to confine myself to a single hour. I'm not very good at confining myself to time. Unfortunately, I talk and I talk and I talk, not necessarily to any good effect. But to give you one or two samples of other concepts within the Declaration of Innocence, which gives you a flavour of Egyptian morality and ideals. Number 29. Hail Seracheru, the assessor Seracheru, who comes forth from Unazet. I have not been a stirrer up of strife. So saying you should go through your life without being a shit stirrer, without winding people up, without causing chaos and discord. Bits, if you want a comparison image from another mythology, in Nordic mythology, you've got the magical squirrel Ratatosk, who runs up and down the world tree Yggdrasil. And he goes from the great eagle who sits at the very top of the branches to the great dragon who is wrapped around the very base roots of the tree. And the squirrel goes up and down, when he gets to the eagle, he goes, oh, you know what that dragon's saying about you now. And when he goes back down to the dragon, he goes, oh, you know what that eagle's saying about you now. And so he spends eternity muckraking. He's like a kind of tabloid newspaper editor, forever slinging innuendo and scandal and gossip and rumour, none of which is ever true, to stir up the warfare between the dragon and the eagle. So he is this mischievous muckraker in the middle, causing mischief. And I've certainly met people like that, who absolutely love winding others up and trying to create fights between people who don't need to be fighting. Fights between people who could probably just either ignore each other or even maybe get on well together, if it wasn't for that Ratatoska running back and forth, winding everyone up and telling lies and muckraking and putting everything in the worst possible light to promote ill feeling and disharmony. So I suspect that there weren't any tabloid newspapers in ancient Egypt, because the journalists and editors at such newspapers would not have been able to stand before the assessor, to stand before Seracheru and say, no, matron, no. I have never muckraked, I've never stirred up strife, I've never caused disharmony and spread gossip and envy and bitterness and nastiness. And so we can think of this time in with the idea of another Egyptian philosophical concept of Ren. Ren is the idea that everything has a sacred name. Every person, every living being, when I say person, I don't just mean humans, cats, dogs, horses, camels, crocodiles, hawks, bees, butterflies, and you name it, everything has a name, and rivers and rocks and trees and daffodils and everything else has a name, the name of the soul. And if this name is said correctly, or I should really say sung correctly, and the act of singing the names correctly is called hekka. To sing the name, to intone it, to chant it, to not, it's not enough just to kind of mumble it, stumble it, bumble it. You've got to resonate it correctly. If you do it correctly, magic happens. Amazing things happen, wonderful things happen. And so there's this huge tradition in Egyptian magic of spoken magic. There are talismans and amulets and objects and so on, but those objects have to be enchanted and brought to life by the singing of the right words over them. And so the real power, even if the amulet is a bit of carved carnelian or something, the real power is in the words that were once sung over that bit of carnelian, to awaken its soul, to instill it with magical properties. Words have power. Now, 21st century, we're very obsessed with identity politics and the idea of not using horrible words about each other, different groups, racial words and sexist language and that kind of business. There is an element of that in it, but it's much, much more widespread, going back to this idea of not stirring up strife. So you might use all the most PC terms possible going, and no one could ever accuse you of using an incorrect word in that sentence, but you might nonetheless be a right stirrer. And so it's this idea of using language correctly, because language is so powerful. So, a comment from Joanne here. So if an Egyptian was aware whilst living that they felt this envy towards someone, did they have any methods for resolving this before they died? Well, yes, this is a good question. Before you died, or indeed to arrange for your mourners to help resolve it for you, if you are one of those people who keeps putting everything off to manana, and then drops down dead before manana arrives. And so you never get around to pulling your finger out and doing it in your lifetime. There are ceremonies of, I suppose what, for lack of a better word, we'd call atonement, of trying to put right what you have done wrong. And part of ma'at is to balance what you have done wrong. So if you have wounded someone, you make restitution. You have taken from them and the scales of balance are tipped. So you must make restitution to attain balance and harmony. So it could be directly to them, if they're willing to accept what you are trying to do for them. And they might hate the sight of you and never want to see you again, which then you can't do much there. But even if you can't do much directly to the person because they can't stand you, or you don't know where they are anymore, or they're dead, or whatever may have happened, nonetheless, you can look at other ways to make balance in the more, what should we say, cosmic sense, to set things to right, to put back that which you took. So if in your envy you went and destroyed their car because you really didn't think they deserved that car, you could try to provide them with a new car, a replacement car. And obviously that would involve you having the money to do so, and you might not have it, but then you could work your backside off to acquire it, to make restitution to them. And if possibly that person turned around and told you exactly where to shove the car keys because they loathed the sight of you and didn't want this car and all the rest of it, that is a problem in itself. If you have a society in which everyone shares the same philosophy, it can be understood that this person I don't like is trying to make restitution to me, and even though I don't like them, it is beholden on me to allow them to make balance. Whereas if you've got a society in which lots of people believe lots of different things, there isn't that same level of beholdens. So the offended party might not necessarily want to allow you to make restitution. In which case you would have to think, how else could I make restitution? Could I work my backside off to buy this replacement car and then give it to a charity that drives very ill people or disabled people, or very elderly people, people who can't access cars for whatever reason, drives them around so that someone can have the benefit of a car to balance out the fact that I have taken away, through my own bitterness and envy and invidia, the car that belonged to Joe Bloggs over there. So you would find a way to do it. The key point here is the actions that you have to perform. So although there are kind of ritual elements, ceremonial elements, and atonement before the gods and so on, if it's just words and waffle with no follow-up action, it's not real atonement. The atonement ultimately, even though I've just said a couple of few minutes ago, language is terrifically important, ultimately, in this sort of a situation, it is the follow-through action that is critical rather than the endless waffle that is critical. So there's people who talk and talk and talk about, oh, I repent of my wicked ways, and they talk and talk, but that's all they ever do, waffle. Nothing more to it than just waffle. And that's not a productive way forward, because if you have caused harm, you must put it right in as much as you can. And there may be occasions when you can't do that, in which case you have to live with the burden of it, I suppose, really. It's a bit grim, and you may ultimately pay the consequences in the halls of vanity. But anyway, getting back to that idea of the importance of words, both words in the magical sense of Ren and the sacred names, the Renu, but also just day-to-day language. We can say shitty, vile things to each other at times. We're all capable and guilty of that one at some stage or another in our life. To be more thoughtful about what we say, how we use language, and is not just with other human beings, in the realm of spirit. Don't make oaths and pledges if you have no intention of following through on them. So again, not to use language carelessly, to promise things, be it God's ancestors, whoever, that you've got no intention of actually following through on, because that will be held against you. To use language to help, to inspire, to guide, to aid, to entertain, to infuse, rather than to harm and to malign and to damage. It's too easy, especially, I'd like to suggest, in this day and age of social media, where people shoot their mouths off, or at least shoot their keyboards off, with barely any conscious thought involved, and they say the most god-awful things and share dishonest, malevolent memes because they like the picture or some stupid bloody reason, with very little thought to the impact that's going to have on anyone else, repeating gossip, repeating malign concepts and ideas, and it goes round and round and round in this festering heap of poison. It becomes a stirring up of strife. And it's not necessary. And the world would be a lot better if we, all of us, me included, made the effort to use our words more advisedly, to guide and aid and help and make people laugh, but in a nice way, not in a snotty way, in a nice way, to spread humour and joy and happiness rather than to spread malevolence and gossip and all sorts of dreadful, awful things. Time-wise, I probably shouldn't go into a third one because that's just going to sideline. So as another example of a philosophical element, I'm going to take here a maxim, a short sort of maxim I'll read to you. It comes from the Instructions of Kagami, which dates back over 4,500 years now, and has a whole series of guidance of how to live your life, instructions given by Kagami. But this little bit from the beginning of the book. Beware of stealing from a destitute man. and of raging against the cripple. Do not stretch out your hand to touch an old man, nor snipe at the words of an elder. Don't let yourself be involved in a fraudulent business. And when it says touch an old man, it doesn't mean a little pat. It means thumping them or hurting them, harming them. So, in other words, don't misuse your power to attack somebody who can't perhaps defend themselves, to steal from a destitute man, to take from those who have nothing, to rage against the cripples, which I suppose you could say is a little bit of a patronising view of disabled people, but to again, nonetheless, to swear and rant and shout at someone who's moving very slowly, you can't move any faster than they're going, to say snotty, horrible, vile things to someone whose life might be quite difficult enough without you spewing your poison out against them, and so on. To dishonour, to deceive, to ill-treat others. And if you want a passage that sums up some guidance on what not to do, and kind of, to a point, encapsulates the 42 declarations of innocence in a somewhat shorter format, then I'd say that passage probably sums up the majority of it. I mean, there's a bit more to the Declaration of Innocence than just that, but it sums up this idea that we shouldn't misuse or abuse our powers, our abilities, our skills, but rather we should protect and aid and support those who are in need, and to help them step towards a greater level of independence where possible. There is that old quote that was very popular on Oxfam posters a while back. Give someone a fish they eat for a day, give them a fishing rod, they can feed themselves for life. There's a strong sense of that comes out in Egyptian philosophy, that it's not about kind of helping people in a patronising pat on the head sort of a way, but rather about empowering people, that they then, having become empowered, no longer need your aid and can go off and stand on their own 2 feet and live their own life and make their own choices and their own decisions, and then overcome whatever problems it was that were limiting them in the first place, because you've given them a little bit of aid to help them do so. We've got, what have we got, 8-ish minutes, give or take. So if we just come back to this idea of the magical language of Hakeem, of the power of the word. There is at base a strong sense that all language, I think I've said that already, all language is magical, but there is a mystical language of creation that runs through the heart of Egyptian philosophy and mythology, for that matter. In the beginning of the cosmos, there's several different creation myths, and they feature various different deities taking on the role of creator, creating the universe by singing it into existence, speaking the sacred names, the Renu, of other gods, of creatures, animals, rocks, trees, mountains, rivers, deserts, and the rest of it, shaping the things around them, bringing them into existence through the power of language and the power of word. And there's various different ways you can understand this, both philosophical and more magical. But given that we've got very little time left, I'll stick to the philosophical ones, and you'll have to wait till later for the magical ones. If I speak the name of a thing, if I name it, it gives me an understanding, an insight into the thing that I have named. If anyone listening to this has ever suffered from a sort of a mystery illness, where doctors have taken a long time to diagnose whatever it is that you've had, so for a long period of time you haven't had a name to put to it, you don't know what it is. You experience the health problems from it, but you don't know actually what it is that's causing it. When you get to the point where a doctor goes, aha, we've worked out it's so-and-so syndrome, and you've got a name for it. It's not so much you naming it, it's the doctor naming it, but there is a name for it. Suddenly you have something you can hold on to with the name. It provides shape, it provides form, it provides a sense of, right, I know what it is now. I can understand this thing, I can put a name to it. And it can also work in more positive, not just in terms of illnesses and sort of unpleasant things. But to give a name to something that is beautiful, that's nebulous, if you've had a transcendent experience, maybe you've been meditating or dreaming or off on a vision quest, something or other, and you've had this most profound, incredible experience, which is, to use my favourite word of the week, ineffable. I've been watching Good Omens. You can't put it into words, and you want to talk to other people about it. You want to say to somebody else, oh, this happened to me, I saw this, I experienced that, I felt the other, and you can't, because there's no words for it in your mother tongue. There is no word for it in the language you speak that describes that thing. It's very difficult. How do you communicate? How do you link to another person if you can't share a word with them? You can't share a concept. You can't put a name to it. So again, the act of suddenly being able to name the thing and then share that experience with another person, because naming is sharing. It's making the thing. It's creating it in not so much the physical world, but in the social world that we share with other beings who also speak the same languages that we do. And if you learn a foreign language, a new language, or you learn a set of jargon terms, a new hobby, a new form of technology, you convert to a new religion and you learn the jargon terms of that religion. Wittgenstein's idea of the kind of framing of language and how we acquire a new language, not just like learning French or German or Japanese or something, but languages connected to activities, then it enables you to connect with people, to share with people you could not have shared with before, because you have no commonality of language to share with them, either at all, in the sense of learning a foreign language you couldn't speak a word of beforehand, or if it's more of a kind of a jargon connected to a particular hobby or activity or religion or whatever, suddenly you can engage with things in a totally different way, because you have acquired the language, the names of what you're doing. And you can engage with people who you might have been, in a sense, very distant from before, because you didn't have that language. Nothing from Joanne. So I've always had a remote interest in Egyptian beliefs, but they have always seemed so strange that I've never connected with them. Oh, there we go, on screen. Oh, thank you. Fascinating talk. Thank you very much. Yes, absolutely. We can all learn from philosophies and gain insights and understandings. The more as I go along, the more I learn about different ancient religions, the more I learn about Taoism, about Shintoism, about Judaism, about Hermeticism, about Norse and Celtic and all sorts of other religions. Whilst there are some quite significant differences between them, there's also a lot of key ideas which keep cropping up again and again under different names. And each language has its own words for things. So the terms used might be different, the languages used might be different, but there are certain key ideas which are very, very widespread. I'm not going to argue that every culture on Earth has them, because that's a grandiose statement. But it fascinates me the way these shared experiences between the disparate groups of humans, much as Joseph Campbell and Carl Jung and various others when they were talking about archetypes, in that way, it's the same experience keeps cropping up, and not just the experience like archetypes of motherhood and fatherhood and so on, but very similar philosophical concepts that are incredibly widespread. And that leads me to wonder if what people are doing is recognizing reality. They may be phrasing it in different ways, different languages, and one speaks this language and another speaks that language, and they use slightly different imagery and slightly different poetic associations. But what they are recognizing is a key feature of the universe. Perhaps not even just the human universe, but a universe that may incorporate a vast number of other beings, thinking, living entities, that also perhaps share some of those experiences with us, which is an idea to end on in the last few seconds, that sacred language is not just a language spoken, sung by humans, but sung by other beings too. And there may be words, concepts, ideas that can be sung in the language of dogs or parrots or giraffes, or all sorts of other creatures which human larynxes couldn't possibly manage. So we have our own range of terms within the human capacity, but there may be many way beyond that other beings sharing. And I'm just giving examples of flesh and blood creatures that we're aware of, let alone beings at other levels of existence who share in this great cosmic sum. But that takes us over the minute, so I'll finish here. I'm not actually sure how to turn this off. I'll work it out in a second, but if you've got any questions, I'm happy to answer stuff by posting messages on the Facebook page. I'll get back to you in time and type you an answer. Thank you for listening, and hopefully that was reasonably interesting, reasonably useful to somebody. Take care.